Welcome to the podcast, To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America, the topic we shall discuss in today's show. A generation under glass. I am Alex.
And I am Sam.
So I want you to imagine, just for a second, a teenager waking up in the morning.
Right?
Before their feet even touch the floor, like before they've spoken a single word to their family or even gotten out of bed, they reach over to their nightstand and they pull this glowing rectangle under the covers with them.
Every single morning.
Right, and within 30 seconds, they're just flooded with images of their peers looking flawless, news alerts about, burning planet, and algorithmic recommendations that are just perfectly calibrated to keep their eyes absolutely locked on the glass.
It's just the default now.
Yeah, the image is so deeply normal to us now that we barely even register it happening. But today, we are unpacking this incredibly dense, multi-layered text that forces us to really look at that image and ask, what exactly happened to the mental health of an entire generation of American youth?
Because something definitely happened. And we're going to be exploring what is essentially a massive collision today. It's a collision of technology, economics, and politics that created this extremely specific moment in time.
A perfect storm.
Exactly, a perfect storm. But we're doing this while deliberately avoiding the trap, and it is a very tempting trap of just looking for a single villain.
Because it's never just one thing.
It's never just one thing, right? And just to give you a sense of the sheer scope of what we're looking at today, the exact subtitle of our source text is American Adolescence, the Mental Health Crisis, and an Unfinished Reckoning.
It's a heavy subtitle, honestly, for a really heavy reality.
It is.
And to ground us right from the jump, the text opens with a quote from December 2021 from the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy.
Oh, yeah, I remember this advisory.
Yeah, he issued this advisory, and he did not mince words at all. He declared, and I quote, "We are in the middle of a national mental health crisis among our children, adolescents, and young adults. The future well-being of our country depends on how we respond."
Which is an incredibly stark warning from the top medical officer in the country. And the reason we're taking this deep dive today is because there is a vast, vital difference between simply having an explanation for a crisis and actually possessing a true understanding of it.
Right, because we all have our pet theories.
Exactly. We all hear the explanations tossed around at dinner tables or, screaming on cable news. It's the phones or it's the schools or it's bad parenting.
Right, everyone's got an opinion.
Everyone does. But truly understanding the architecture of this crisis requires us to completely strip away those assumptions and look at the unvarnished data. I mean, we really have to establish the real baseline of before we can start pointing fingers at after.
Okay, so let's unpack that baseline. Let's look at the world of before. Because one of the most striking things the source material does is point to a really highly specific inflection point.
It's not a gradual shift at all.
No, it's not this gentle slope over 50 years. There's a moment where the ground seemingly just gives way, and the text traces it back to roughly 2011.
Yeah. 2011 is the fulcrum here. And to understand why that year is the focal point, the source relies heavily on the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Specifically, this thing called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, or the YRBS.
Okay, and why is that specific survey so important?
What's crucial about the YRBS is its consistency over time. The CDC has been asking high school students across the country the exact same set of standardized questions since 1991.
So they can compare apples to apples.
Right. They ask very direct things like, have you felt so sad or hopeless for 2 weeks or more that you stopped doing your usual activities? Have you seriously considered suicide? Have you made a plan?
Wow. And for 2 straight decades, from 1991 to 2011, the answers were actually pretty encouraging, weren't they?
They really were. From 1991 all the way up to roughly 2011, those numbers were relatively stable. In fact, in many critical areas, the trends were actually improving.
Right, improving.
Yeah, teen suicide rates had actually fallen from a peak in the late 80s, and they continued to trend downward all the way through the mid-2000s. There was this general sense that whatever we were doing as a society, better interventions, school programs, general stability, it was working.
Okay.
But then, right around 2011, the lines on the graph just violently bend upward. It's not a statistical blip, it's a total rupture.
The numbers are staggering when you really sit with them. The text lays them out with just brutal clarity. In 2011, 28% of high school students reported persistent sadness. Fast forward to 2021, and that number jumped to 42%.
That is a massive jump for a population-level survey.
It is. It eased just a little bit to roughly 40% in the 2023 data, but it's still just catastrophically high. And that's just the overall average.
Right. The averages mask the worst of it.
They do, because when you start breaking this down by demographics, it gets significantly more alarming. For girls, the rate of persistent sadness peaked at 57% in 2021.
Over half of all teenage girls.
More than half. And for youth who identify as LGBTQ plus or, it hit 69%.
We're talking about tens of millions of teenagers in a state of sustained clinical level despair. Now, whenever you present survey data that relies on self-reporting, where you're asking teenagers to describe their own internal emotional state, there is a natural, very human skepticism that kicks in.
Sure. Yeah.
You might be listening to this right now and wondering, well, are kids today just more willing to talk about their feelings? Has the societal stigma around mental health decreased so much that they're just more vocal or maybe even a bit melodramatic about normal teenage angst?
Which, honestly, is a totally fair question. If society spends 10 years telling kids, hey, it's okay not to be okay, you should talk about your feelings, you'd naturally expect a spike in kids saying they aren't okay.
It's a completely logical hypothesis. I mean, it makes intuitive sense.
Right.
But here's where the source material completely refutes that idea, and it does so using hard, unmediated data. If this were just a matter of a changing cultural vocabulary, we would only see a rise in survey responses. We'd see more talking, but not necessarily more physiological harm.
Okay, so what did we actually see?
The text points out that alongside the survey data, we see a simultaneous, sharp, undeniably real rise in emergency department visits for self-harm.
Oh, yeah, you cannot fake an emergency room visit.
You absolutely cannot. And even more tragically, we see the suicide rate among girls aged 10 to 14 literally doubling between 2007 and 2015.
Doubling for 10 to 14-year-olds.
Yes, a culture that just feels more comfortable talking about sadness does not spontaneously produce a doubling of completed suicides in middle school girls. That is a hard physical metric of immense suffering that has nothing to do with shifting vocabulary.
It makes me think of those self-reporting surveys like the check engine light on a car's dashboard.
Okay, yeah.
It's really easy to look at that light, roll your eyes, and say, oh, it's probably just a faulty sensor. These modern cars are too sensitive. The engine is actually totally fine. You can talk yourself into ignoring the light. But those emergency room visits, those hospital admission records for self-harm, that is thick black smoke pouring out from under the hood of the car.
Exactly.
You cannot just blame a sensitive dashboard sensor when the engine is visibly on fire.
That's the perfect analogy. The engine is genuinely overheating. And the text asks us to pause and truly absorb the sheer scale of what is happening. We aren't talking about a niche subculture here. We are talking about tens of millions of kids.
Right.
But to really understand why that 2011 shift is so jarring, the text asks us to contrast it against the historical landscape of adolescence. Because we tend to forget that adolescence, like as a distinct psychological and cultural stage, is actually a relatively modern American invention.
Yeah, that part of the text was fascinating to me. Before the 20th century, you were a child, and then you were essentially just a working adult. There was no in-between.
Right. You went from playing with toys to working in a factory or on a farm. And then you hit the 1950s, and we had these massive delinquency panics. Adults were terrified about youth rebelling. You had James Dean, you had leather jackets, you had actual Senate subcommittees investigating whether juvenile delinquency was going to, destroy the fabric of the nation.
Wild teenagers.
Exactly. The concept of the commercial teenager was essentially codified in 1944 when 17 magazine was launched. That's when marketers figured out how to monetize adolescent insecurity and identity formation.
So adults have literally always panicked over what kids are doing, whether it's rock and roll, or the twist, or heavy metal in the 80s, or video games.
Always. Every generation has its panic. But the text draws a massive distinction here. Historically, American institutions only really noticed teenagers when they were misbehaving. The panic was always about outward rebellion, noise, and disruption. Breaking things.
Right, external acting out.
But this current crisis is fundamentally different. This is teenagers simply suffering. It's an inward implosion. It's an epidemic of sadness, anxiety, and isolation, rather than an epidemic of broken windows and street racing.
It's so quiet.
It's very quiet. And it is impossible to ignore that 2011 was not just a random year pulled from a hat. It aligns perfectly, almost uncomfortably well, with a massive, unprecedented technological shift.
It's the year the ground shifted under everyone's feet.
Yeah.
Because 2010 and 2011 mark the exact arrival of majority smartphone ownership among American teens.
That's the tipping point.
Right. It wasn't just a few rich kids who had them anymore. It became the cultural default. If you didn't have one, you were the weird one. It's also the exact window when Instagram launched October 2010 and Snapchat followed right behind it in 2011.
And that location shift is
All
huge.
right, because the machine moved from the family computer desk in the living room, where your parents could at least see the screen over your shoulder, directly into the teenager's pocket.
To their bedroom. To the bathroom.
Everywhere. And the text goes into deep, deep detail about the mechanics of these platforms, because we really have to stop treating them like they're just digital bulletin boards.
They're emphatically not neutral tools. They aren't just corkboards where you pin a photo. In the early days of social media, think about early Facebook around 2005 or 2006, you had what engineers call rule-based algorithms.
Like chronological feeds.
Exactly. Human engineers wrote very transparent rules. Show my friends' posts and weight them by how recently they were posted. If a friend posted an hour ago, I see it before the post from yesterday. It was essentially a digital directory. But the platforms that dominate today, TikTok, modern Instagram, YouTube, they rely on something entirely different. They use machine learning recommendation engines.
And this is where the how and the why become so important. How does a machine learning recommendation engine actually work in practice? Because it's not chronological.
No, it's not. These are incredibly complex neural networks trained on vast, unimaginably large data sets of behavioral data. And they have one single overriding optimization goal, time on app.
That's it. Just keep them on the app.
That is the only metric that matters to the machine. They do not care if the content makes you feel happy, informed, anxious, or enraged. They don't have a moral compass. They only care if you keep scrolling. If fury keeps you scrolling, they serve fury. If body image anxiety keeps you scrolling, they serve that.
Which brings us to one of the most explosive, revelatory parts of the source text. The 2021 Facebook files leak by the whistleblower, Frances Haugen.
Oh, this was a massive moment.
It was huge, because this wasn't just external speculation from angry parents or pundits. This was the company's own internal data being dragged into the light. And it was just damning. It showed that 32% of teen girls who already felt bad about their bodies felt worse after using Instagram.
A third of them.
Yeah. But what's really chilling is the mechanism behind it. It's how the algorithm actively learns from a child's vulnerabilities.
Yes, the text explains how incredibly granular this surveillance is. The algorithm tracks what are called micro-hesitations.
Micro-hesitations, what does that mean?
It's not just what you explicitly hit like on or what you comment on. It's how long your thumb stops moving on the screen.
Wow.
If a 13-year-old girl is scrolling through a feed and she pauses for just an extra half second on a post about extreme dieting or hyper-filtered fitness model, the algorithm registers that hesitation. It learns from it. It literally trains itself in real time to serve her increasingly extreme material because the math dictates that this specific type of content is what captures her attention.
It's preying on the insecurity.
Yes. And the company knew this was happening. That's what the leak proved. They had the internal data proving the causal link between their product design and deteriorating mental health metrics in these vulnerable subgroups.
That is the critical distinction the source makes, and it's a profound ethical failure.
Yeah.
It's the contrast between corporate knowledge of specific localized harm versus the broader scientific debate that was happening out in the open. The company's own researchers literally tested design changes to reduce this appearance-related content. They knew how to fix it, but they found that implementing those changes reduced overall user engagement. People didn't spend as much time on the app, so they chose not to implement those safety changes at scale.
They prioritized the growth metric over the safety metric.
Exactly. Meanwhile, while the company had this crystal-clear internal data locked away, the academic world outside was having this massive, sprawling, very public quarrel over the population-level science.
Let's break that academic clash down because it perfectly illustrates why this crisis has been so hard to definitively pin down for the public. On one side of the debate, you have prominent researchers like Jonathan Haidt, who is pushing what he calls the Great Rewiring hypothesis.
Right, we've heard a lot about him.
Yeah, his argument is highly structural. He argues that smartphones didn't just add a new activity to a teenager's day, they fundamentally displaced childhood play. They took face-to-face, unstructured, synchronized social interaction, the kind of play that actually builds resilience and social skills, and replaced it with curated, asynchronous, high-stakes digital comparison.
Basically, instead of playing pickup basketball or hanging out at the mall and being awkward together, kids are sitting alone in their rooms, staring at metrics of their own popularity.
Precisely. They are managing a personal brand at 14. But on the exact opposite side of this academic divide, you have highly credentialed skeptics like Candace Odgers and Amy Orban. And the text lays out their counter-argument very clearly.
What's their pushback?
Their main critique is methodological. They argue that the massive data sets Haidt and others rely on are mostly cross-sectional.
Let's clarify that term for a second for everyone listening. Cross-sectional data basically means it takes a snapshot of a single moment in time, right?
Yes, exactly. A cross-sectional study looks at a group of kids today and says, okay, the ones using social media the most are the most depressed. It shows a very strong correlation. But crucially, a snapshot cannot prove causation. You don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Right.
So Odgers and Orban propose what is known as the depression-driven use hypothesis, meaning kids who are already depressed, already socially anxious, or living in chaotic homes naturally retreat to their screens because the real world feels too difficult to navigate.
Oh, I see. So the screen isn't the poison causing the issue.
Exactly. They argue it's the painkiller the kids are reaching for to cope with existing distress.
And the text points out that Orban and another researcher even ran this massive statistical analysis and concluded that the statistical effect of social media use on a teenager's well-being was so tiny, it was roughly equivalent to the emotional impact of wearing eyeglasses.
Which is an incredibly provocative claim to make in this climate.
Okay, I have to push back here. I mean, wearing eyeglasses, come on. That feels incredibly dismissive of the lived reality of millions of families who are watching their kids fall apart over these apps.
You just sound jarring.
But I suppose it forces us to ask a necessary historical question. We talked about the 1950s earlier. Let's look at 1954. There was a massive national panic over comic books. A prominent psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham wrote a best-selling book called Seduction of the Innocent, claiming that Batman and horror comics were literally causing juvenile delinquency.
Oh, yeah, they had actual Senate hearings over Batman.
Right. Politicians were grilling comic book publishers over violence on national television. So are we absolutely 100% sure this isn't just the latest iteration of adults freaking out over whatever new thing kids are doing? Are we just repeating the comic book panic with smartphones?
It is a vital question to ask, and the text acknowledges that having historical humility is essential here. We have panicked over the radio, over Dungeons and Dragons, over television, but the text balances that humility against the profound, unique structural differences of modern technology. A television broadcast of a Western in 1965 could not observe the child watching it.
No.
It couldn't recalibrate its plot based on the child's micro-hesitations or pupil dilation. The comic book in 1954 didn't track how long a kid stared at a specific panel and then magically redraw the next page to exploit that kid's specific psychological vulnerabilities.
Medium was static. It was a one-way street.
Exactly. Social media algorithms are a two-way surveillance street. They operate using fundamental, scientifically mapped principles of behavioral psychology, specifically the concept of intermittent reinforcement.
Like a casino.
This is the exact same psychological mechanism used in slot machines. You pull the lever or you refresh the feed, and you don't know if you're going to get a reward, a punishment, or nothing at all. That unpredictability is what creates compulsive behavior. It literally hijacks the brain's dopamine reward system.
Wow.
The source even quotes early Facebook president Sean Parker, who bluntly admitted they intentionally built a system exploiting psychological vulnerabilities to consume as much conscious attention as possible. It wasn't an accident. It was the blueprint from day one.
So the machine is fundamentally, structurally different from anything humanity has ever handed to a teenager before. But here's where the text makes a really brilliant pivot. It argues that if we become obsessed with the smartphone, like if we only stare at the glowing screens in the teenager's hands, we completely miss the room that the teenager's sitting in.
Yes.
We miss the environment shaping their reality. What else has been happening in the background of American life over this exact same time frame?
This is where the source material gets into the hidden villains, the deep structural societal pressures that have absolutely nothing to do with Wi-Fi or algorithms. The text identifies several massive shifts that perfectly coincided with this mental health crisis. First, there is the long, brutal economic hangover of the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, right. The timeline lines up perfectly.
You have to remember the timeline. The teenagers who hit high school in the late 2010s and early 2020s were born right around that 2008 crash. They grew up in households dealing with persistent material uncertainty, housing insecurity, job losses, and just the chronic, pervasive stress that parents inevitably, even unintentionally, pass down to their children.
It's like an ambient anxiety in the house.
Mm.
The kids absorb the tension at the dinner table. And then you layer on top of that economic anxiety what the text calls a hyper-credentialing academic arms race.
Yes.
And this isn't just affecting lower-income families. The source cites fascinating research by developmental psychologist Sunia Luthar, who specifically looked at affluent, high-achieving communities. You would naturally think kids with every economic advantage, the best tutors, the safest neighborhoods, would be totally insulated from this distress.
You would definitely think so. But Luther found the exact opposite. She found rates of clinical anxiety, depression, and substance abuse in high-achieving, wealthy communities that actually rivaled and sometimes exceeded those found in economically deprived areas.
That's wild. Why?
Because childhood for a massive swath of the population has been turned into a relentless, high-stakes resume-building exercise. The pressure to succeed, to get into the elite college, to justify the family's investment in them, it is absolutely crushing them.
And while the pressure on these kids has gone through the roof, the traditional support structures that used to catch them when they fell have completely eroded. The text references Robert Putnam's famous sociological work, Bowling Alone.
Right, detailing the slow collapse of community.
Exactly. It details the slow, steady collapse of civic and religious communities in America over the last few decades. We're talking about the disappearance of neighborhood associations, local congregations, community bowling leagues, robust local youth groups.
The third spaces.
Right, the third spaces. The spaces where kids used to interact with adults who were not their parents grading their behavior or their teachers grading their academic performance. Those low-stakes, supportive communal spaces have largely vanished. Kids are either at school achieving, at home alone, or on their phones.
There's no release valve. And we cannot forget the existential dread hovering over all of this. The source cites a deeply concerning global survey showing that 59% of youth are very or extremely worried about climate change.
59%.
More than half of the young people surveyed literally feel that humanity is doomed. I mean, pause and think about the psychological weight of that belief when you were 14 years old.
I really want you, listening right now, to connect this to your own life or the kids in your life. Think about the sheer volume of expectations we place on young people today. We expect adolescents to carry the psychic weight of a highly volatile, rapidly shifting global economy, where gig work is replacing stable careers.
Yeah.
We expect them to internalize a precarious, frightening climate future. They are the constant, 247 targets of a $20 billion influencer marketing industry designed specifically to make them feel physically and socially inadequate, so they will buy beauty products or lifestyle brands.
It's exhausting just hearing it listed out.
Right. And we have expected them to carry all this weight while simultaneously stripping away their physical communities. When you put all the structural failures together, the question isn't why are they in crisis? The question is how could they not be in crisis?
It is a perfect, devastating storm. And then, as the text points out, the COVID-19 pandemic arrived.
Yeah.
But it is absolutely crucial to understand how the source material frames the pandemic. The pandemic was not the origin of the crisis.
Oh, that's a huge point.
The baseline numbers were already terrible in 2018 and 2019. The pandemic acted as a massive amplifier of existing vulnerabilities. The lockdowns took away the last remaining structured supervision and the essential rites of passage that anchor a teenager's life. Graduations, proms, sports seasons, theater productions.
Gone overnight.
It trapped them in whatever environment they had, good or bad, with only their screens as an outlet. The text notes that in late 2020, mental health emergency visits spiked by 31% for adolescent girls and 24% for adolescent boys compared to 2019.
And the definitive proof that the pandemic was an amplifier and not the root cause is found in the 2023 data. The numbers showed what the text calls a partial recovery once schools finally reopened, routines somewhat normalized, and kids got back to socializing.
But only partial.
Exactly. The critical point is that the numbers did not return to the baseline of 2010. They stayed dangerously elevated, proving the structural crisis was there all along, merely supercharged by the virus.
And that structural crisis has varying faces. It doesn't look the same for every demographic. The source delves into groups that often get ignored in the mainstream narrative. For example, it highlights the boy crisis.
Right, which looks very different than what girls are experiencing.
Very different. The data shows that while girls show much higher rates of internalizing distress-like clinical sadness, eating disorders, and self-harm, boys are manifesting their distress through profound retreat.
Retreating where?
into rising rates of severe, paralyzing loneliness, deep retreat into digital gaming worlds as a substitute for real-world achievement, and a terrifying vulnerability to the radicalizing manosphere online, where isolated boys are said misogynistic and extremist ideologies by algorithmic recommendation engines.
The text also doesn't shy away from profound racial disparities. It details the unique, compounding stressors on Black adolescents navigating systemic inequalities, the rising rates of sadness among Hispanic youth, and the ongoing heartbreaking tragedy of the Native American youth suicide crisis, which often vastly outpaces other demographics, and the heavy psychological toll on minority students who report experiencing racism and discrimination in their own schools.
With so much suffering distributed across so many different groups, our conversation has to turn to the most politically charged demographic data in the source material and how our institutions, our lawmakers, have reacted to it.
And right here, we need to be very clear with you listening. We are going to outline the highly contentious political territory regarding LGBTQ plus youth, gender-affirming care, and legislative battles.
Yeah.
We are strictly laying out the factual arguments from the text to understand the gridlock. We aren't taking a side. We are reporting what the source says.
Exactly. We are just outlining the parameters of the debate as presented in the text.
So the text unpacks some staggering data regarding LGBTQ plus youth. We mentioned it earlier, but in the 2023 data, an astonishing 65% reported persistent sadness or hopelessness. To explain this immense gap in well-being between them and their heterosexual, cisgender peers, the source uses what psychologists call the minority stress framework.
The minority stress framework is crucial for understanding the how and the why of this specific data point. It posits that the chronic psychological burden of navigating an environment where your identity is stigmatized, debated, or legislated against creates a constant state of hyperarousal in the nervous system.
Like you're constantly on edge.
Yes. It's the exhaustion of constantly scanning a room to see if you are safe, of hiding who you are or facing overt bullying. Over time, that chronic stress physically and mentally wears a person down, leading to higher rates of depression and suicidality. The text then reports on the wave of state legislatures that have recently moved to restrict gender-affirming medical care for minors and ban classroom discussions of sexual orientation and gender identity.
And what's the impact of that?
It cites extensive surveys from the Trevor Project that link these highly hostile public political environments directly to elevated suicide risk among LGBTQ plus youth, arguing that the political debate itself is causing measurable psychological harm.
But the text also outlines the counter case that is driving this legislation. It points to a live medical and ethical debate, specifically referencing a major 2024 United Kingdom government review, often referred to as the Cass Review.
Right.
This UK review urged extreme clinical caution regarding certain medical interventions for minors, like puberty blockers, concluding that the long-term evidence base for these treatments was significantly weaker than often represented by advocates.
Yes. The source notes that advocates for restriction in the U.S. often cite this international caution, arguing they are operating out of medical prudence, a desire to protect children from irreversible changes, and a defense of parental rights rather than animus or hostility.
Okay.
Furthermore, the source brings up the causal inference argument in sociological research. This is the argument that states passing these restrictive laws might have other confounding variables, like different economic baselines, rural healthcare shortages, or distinct cultural climates that independently affect the mental health of all youth in those states. This makes it difficult to prove statistically that the laws themselves are the sole driver of the mental health disparity.
And this intense, fundamental polarization bleeds directly into the broader legislative battlefield. You can see the gridlock perfectly when the text examines the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA, which was introduced in 2022.
Oh, KOSI is a perfect example of this.
Yeah, the core mechanism of KOSA was something called a duty of care. This would legally require tech platforms to design their products in a way that actively prevented specific harms to minors, rather than just reacting to bad content after the fact. I mean, it sounds like a no-brainer, right? Keep kids safe by design.
It sounds incredibly simple on paper, but the text explains how this duty of care was utterly crushed in a legislative vice from both sides of the political spectrum. It was a fascinating, though tragic, case study in gridlock.
What happened?
It was fiercely opposed by the left, driven by fears from civil liberties groups and LGBTQ plus organizations. Their concern was that conservative state attorneys general would weaponize the vague language of harm, labeling LGBTQ plus educational content or support groups as inherently harmful to minors, and use the law to force tech companies to censor that content.
And simultaneously, in a bizarre horseshoe effect, KOSI was opposed by the right.
Yes.
Conservative advocacy groups feared that the exact same duty of care would be used by progressive federal regulators or left-leaning states to force tech companies to censor conservative speech, debate about gender ideology, or politically disfavored viewpoints under the guise of protecting kids from hate speech or misinformation.
This specific legislative failure illustrates the deeper systemic problem the text identifies. We essentially have two Americas looking at the exact same mental health crisis through entirely different, mutually exclusive lenses.
They can't even agree on what the problem is.
Exactly. The conservative framing focuses heavily on restricting the platforms, eliminating smartphones in schools, and aggressively reinforcing parental authority and traditional family structures as the bulwark against the crisis. The progressive framing, on the other hand, focuses on structural inequalities, underfunded public schools, dismantling systemic racism, and fiercely protecting vulnerable identities.
And because each side possesses a valid slice of the empirical evidence, yes, phones are bad, yes, systemic poverty causes depression, they cannot agree on the whole picture.
Right. The result is that comprehensive federal solutions simply fail to build durable coalitions. They die in committee.
And while the politicians argue over framings and hypothetical censorship, the actual teenagers still need help today. Which brings us to a terrifying, practical question that the text forces us to confront. What happens when an adolescent in this country, against all odds, actually reaches out for a lifeline? When they tell a parent or a teacher, "I'm not okay, I need help." What is on the other end of that phone call?
According to the brutal reality outlined in the text, what is on the other end is often a massive, gaping structural void. The source details a staggering treatment gap in the United States. More than half of adolescents with a diagnosable clinical mental health condition receive absolutely no treatment for it.
More than half. None.
None. Zero. And a huge part of this is geographical and systemic. Nearly 130 million Americans currently live in what the federal government officially designates as mental health professional shortage areas.
The text dives deep into the history of mental health parity laws to explain why this is happening. These were federal laws passed in 1996, expanded in 2008, and strengthened again in 2010 under the Affordable Care Act. The entire legislative intent was to force insurance companies to cover mental health care the exact same way they cover physical health care.
Right.
If they cover a broken arm, they have to cover clinical depression.
But the text reveals that these parity laws have suffered from a catastrophic, decades-long failure of enforcement. Insurance companies use subtle tactics to limit care. They create ghost networks.
Ghost networks.
Yeah, these are directories full of psychiatrists who aren't taking new patients, have moved, or don't even exist anymore. They impose burdensome prior authorization requirements for therapy that they would never require for asthma medication. Parity on paper is entirely meaningless if a family in crisis literally cannot find a single in-network adolescent psychiatrist within a 100-mile radius who will actually take their insurance.
And because the clinical, medical side of the equation is failing so spectacularly, the entire burden of this crisis falls onto the one place where kids are legally required to be: the public schools. Schools are where kids spend their waking hours, so they become the de facto mental health clinics.
They are forced into it.
Right. But the text analyzes the school counselor crisis, and the math is just impossible. The American School Counselor Association recommends a ratio of 1 counselor for every 250 students. That's already a heavy caseload. But the national average is 372 to 1.
And that's just the average.
Exactly. In many lower-income, under-resourced districts, you're looking at ratios of 500, 600, or even 800 to 1.
Let's visualize what that actually means for a school counselor on a Tuesday morning. You cannot do preventive, relationship-based therapy when you have 500 students assigned to you. You spend your entire day doing college scheduling, managing truancy, and putting out immediate 5-alarm fires. Suicide ideation triage, self-harm interventions, violent outbursts. The counselor becomes an emergency room doctor in a war zone rather than a preventative care provider.
The text does mention one fleeting moment of hope, though. The bipartisan Safer Communities Act, passed in 2022 following the Uvalde tragedy. It poured about $2 billion specifically into school mental health grants. The source says this was the largest federal investment in school-based mental health in American history. It felt like a real turning point.
It did, but then the text immediately contextualizes that number, contrasting that $2 billion with the reality of the need. Experts estimate we actually need $12 to $15 billion annually, every single year, just to close the current access gap.
So $2 billion is a drop in the ocean.
A tiny drop. And the story of that specific $2 billion gets significantly darker when the text looks at the events of 2025 and 2026. It details a massive, chaotic clawback of those very funds.
What happened?
The incoming Trump administration canceled the grant renewals for hundreds of these established school mental health programs. Their stated reasoning was rooted in the culture wars. They raised objections over the diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, criteria that the previous administration had used to initially award the grants to marginalized districts.
And the fallout from that policy shift was immediate and devastating. 16 state attorneys general sued the federal government to stop the clawback. By 2026, federal court rulings had created absolute legal chaos, with injunctions and appeals flying back and forth. This left local school districts totally stranded in the middle of the academic year.
Just completely in the dark.
The text provides incredibly vivid, heartbreaking examples of this. It talks about a rural superintendent in Oregon who had used the federal money to finally triple his mental health staff, only to suddenly have the rug pulled out and be forced to fire them all. It highlights a university training program in New York that was pipelining desperately needed social workers into urban schools, forced to shut down its operations overnight.
The human cost of that political maneuvering is just staggering.
Think about that timeline for a second. It is literally like a city deciding to build a brand new hospital, finally putting desperately ill patients into the intensive care beds, and then the government walks in and turns off the electricity right in the middle of a delicate surgery because two politicians are having a zoning dispute over the parking lot.
Wow.
The patients are the ones who bleed out on the table while the politicians argue.
It is a devastating analogy, and sadly, it perfectly captures the institutional dysfunction the source describes. And the text points out the inevitable next step in the American system. When legislatures fail to pass laws, when vital funding is clawed back for political points, and when the healthcare systems completely break down, Americans invariably turn to the final arena they have left to seek redress: the courtroom.
And that leads us to the massive, unprecedented wave of litigation that the source covers in its final sections. In October 2023, you had 41 state attorneys general filing a massive coordinated lawsuit against Meta, the parent company of Instagram and Facebook, accusing them of intentionally hooking children.
Which was huge news.
Huge. But the text really zooms in on a specific watershed trial from the spring of 2026, the KGM trial.
This trial is framed by the source as a fundamental turning point in how we understand tech liability in this country. A young plaintiff, identified as KGM, sued the major platforms, alleging that using YouTube and Instagram from early childhood actively contributed to their severe depression, eating disorders, and a clinically diagnosed addiction to the platforms.
Right, but people sue tech companies all the time.
They do, and lawsuits against tech companies usually get dismissed pretty quickly. But in this case, the jury came back and found Meta 70% liable and YouTube 30% liable for the damages.
But the critical distinction the text makes, and we need to really understand this legal nuance, is why they were found liable. It was not because of the specific harmful content that other users posted on the platforms.
Right.
It wasn't about a specific pro-anorexia video or a cyberbullying comment. They were found liable for the product design itself.
Yes. The infinite scroll, the intermittent variable rewards, the algorithmic notifications pinging a child's phone at 2 a.m., the metrics showing a teenager exactly how many people did or did not like them today.
That is a massive seismic shift in the legal landscape. By targeting the fundamental engineering design of the app rather than the user-generated content, the plaintiffs successfully bypassed Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act.
Let's explain Section 230 for a minute because it's the foundational law of the modern internet.
Okay.
Passed in 1996, it essentially says that an interactive computer service cannot be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another user. It's the law that historically shields tech companies from being sued over what their users post.
So if I post something defamatory on Facebook, you can sue me, but you can't sue Facebook.
Right. Section 230 is why social media as a business model exists. But the KGM plaintiffs successfully argued that Section 230 protects you if you are a neutral bulletin board. It does not protect you if you design a slot machine that intentionally addicts a minor, regardless of what pictures are spinning on the slot machine's reels.
But the text is very careful and intellectually honest to examine the tech company's defense here, too. They didn't just roll over.
Not at all.
The platforms mounted a robust defense arguing that recommendation algorithms, the map that decides what video you see next, are in fact a form of editorial curation. Think about it like a newspaper editor deciding what story goes on the front page. And editorial curation is fundamentally protected by the First Amendment. They essentially argued that regulating their algorithmic design is regulating speech by another name.
It's a very strong constitutional argument. Furthermore, the companies pointed right back to the unsettled science we discussed earlier. They stood before the jury and said, look, if the top academic researchers in the world, the Jonathan Haidts and the Candace Odgers, cannot agree if social media actually causes this mental health crisis, how can a lay jury in California definitively assign millions of dollars in damages based on an unproven standard of causation?
Right.
How can you punish us for a crime that science isn't sure we committed?
It is a messy, chaotic, entirely unsettled legal frontier. We are essentially trying to regulate the 21st century psychological machine using 20th century legal frameworks.
It's like trying to regulate a spaceship with maritime law.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
To gain some much-needed perspective on how bizarre this situation is, the expert in the text asks us to look outward, into the global mirror. How are other developed nations handling this exact same technology, and what are their mental health outcomes?
The international contrast is profoundly sobering. The text looks at the United Kingdom, for instance. Teenagers in the UK have very similar rates of smartphone and social media usage as American teens. And yes, they have seen a rise in anxiety, but the UK government actively stepped in.
What do?
They passed a strict online safety act, imposing actual design obligations on platforms to protect children. But even more crucially, they have the National Health Service. They have a system of universal mental health coverage that doesn't rely on navigating ghost networks or fighting insurance claims.
The source also looks at the Nordic countries. High social media use, high tech penetration, but significantly lower rates of adolescent depression and suicide compared to the U.S. Why? Because they have universal health care, dramatically lower rates of economic inequality, and incredibly robust social safety nets that insulate families from the kind of crushing economic anxiety we discussed earlier.
And then there is Australia, which took the most drastic step mentioned in the text. The source notes that Australia instituted an outright national ban on social media for anyone under the age of 16 in 2025, prioritizing child welfare over tech industry profits in a way the U.S. political system has been entirely unable to do.
So as a listener, you have to ask yourself, what does this global mirror actually say about America? Our teenagers are holding the exact same iPhones, running the exact same TikTok algorithms as teenagers in Finland or the UK or Australia.
The exact same tech.
But our crisis is deeper, sharper, and more lethal. Why? Because our crisis is amplified by our uniquely American conditions. We have a threadbare social safety net that lets families fall into poverty. We have an incredibly complex, profit-driven, insurance-dependent health system that leaves millions of vulnerable kids without access to basic psychiatric care. We have deep structural inequality that turns childhood into a high-stakes competition.
And they have the lawsuits.
And we have a highly litigious culture that relies on messy, years-long lawsuits to solve problems because our actual legislative bodies are too paralyzed by polarization and lobbying to pass protective laws.
Which brings the source material to its final, deeply sobering realization. When you look at all these interlocking failures, why is this youth mental health crisis so impossibly hard to solve in America? It is because adolescents are definitionally not a constituency with actual power.
They can't vote.
They cannot vote in the elections that determine school funding. They cannot donate to the political action committees that lobby against tech regulation. They cannot organize massive lobbying firms to fight for mental health parity. They simply cannot threaten the jobs of the politicians who shape the economic and technological realities of their everyday lives.
They are the most vulnerable group, and they have the least amount of leverage. And that ultimately is why the single villain narrative we talked about at the beginning is so incredibly dangerous. If we only blame the smartphone, if we just point at Mark Zuckerberg or TikTok and say, they did it, we let everyone else off the hook.
We let the whole system off the hook.
Right. We let the tech companies take the heat, sure, but we completely absolve the politicians who continuously underfund our public schools. We absolve the broken, labyrinthine, profit-driven healthcare system that denies care to kids in crisis. We let the political gridlock and the culture wars continue unabated. The phone in the teenager's hand is absolutely part of the story, a huge part. But treating it as the only story is a spectacular failure of societal responsibility.
It requires a level of institutional seriousness and sustained commitment that, as the text concludes, we have simply not yet mustered. We have spent a decade naming the problem, measuring the despair, and pointing fingers. But we have fundamentally refused to build or pay for the actual systemic answers.
This structural failure to protect our most vulnerable isn't just happening in the digital space. The despair we see in our youth, the addiction to algorithms, the lack of community support, and the failure of our healthcare systems, all of these threads connect to a much larger tapestry of American crisis. And this brings us to the truly remarkable thing we need to share with you about the source we've been unpacking today. This entire incredibly detailed conversation we just had was derived directly from the second book of a massive 30-volume series. The series is To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America, and the book is titled Volume 2, Fentanyl Nation, Inside America's Opioid Catastrophe, authored by Sue B. Howell.
It's a phenomenal piece of sociological research. What makes it so brilliant is that it explores not just the youth mental health crisis and isolation, but how the underlying causes, the alienation, the economic despair, the systemic failure of our safety nets interlock with the broader American landscape of addiction, whether it's addiction to a screen or addiction to opioids. It's a masterclass in connecting the dots.
And I am thrilled to say that this incredible book is now available in all Amazon bookstores across the world. You really owe it to yourself to dive into the full text to understand the complete picture of what is happening in our country right now.
Absolutely. Go check out the book, leave your comments, and share your feedback. We would love to hear how these issues resonate with what you see in your own communities, in your own schools, and in your own families.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and take care of each other out there.